Welcome to the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast, the space where research meets the real world. I'm Dionne Stevens, and today we're talking about hip-hop feminism with Dr. Aisha Durham, a professor of media and communication at the University of South Florida. Dr. Durham is a Black feminist cultural critic whose research explores media representations in everyday life. She's also the co-editor of the first hip-hop feminist anthology, Homegirls Make Some Noise, a former contributor to the Crunk Feminist Collective, and an advisory board member for the Smithsonian Anthology of Hip-Hop and Rap. To democratize knowledge, Dr. Durham writes public scholarship and provides cultural analysis about hip-hop for news and entertainment outlets, including CNN, NPR, Ms. Magazine, and the Times of London. First of all, I'm so excited that we're talking, and since we met way back when at University of Georgia, Bulldogs back then. Yes, yes. And so it's great to see that where we are today, and especially where you are, I've been following your work. And without question, you're one of, if not the leading scholars around hip hop feminism. And so I'm so proud that I get to know you and I get the chance to speak with you around this work. And so I want to maybe, if you want to just tell a little bit about your story, how you got into hip hop feminism and how you kind of galvanized this to be a real sort of central piece of your personal and research identity.
Yeah, so I think when I didn't put the idea of hip hop feminism together until University of Georgia, where I had this book by Joan Morgan in my hand. And I said, wow, everything makes sense in terms of the kind of generationally specific and class specific understanding of Black feminism. So in some ways, hip hop feminism made Black feminism more salient to me. I started off as a journalist, just like Joe Morgan. And I was a journalist and a correspondent since high school. Some of the first things that I wanted to write about were the girls and the women of my community, because I thought that the ways in which we're seen, and this is me coming from public housing in Norfolk, Virginia, the ways in which poor Black women and poor Black girls are seen, it's always as a problem. It's always as, at risk of doing something. So I wanted to change those kinds of narratives, but I also early on recognized the power of media. And at the time, we're talking about the 1990s going into the 2000s, hip hop is one of those sites or one of those spaces where Black women in particular were hyper visible. So if you did not see us in terms of news media, you saw us in entertainment media. And so even if I never listened to a rap song, and I did, my brother was a DJ and I wrote poetry at the time, that was still an important site if you wanted to talk about the representation and the significance of that representation in terms of Black women in society, not just in entertainment, but how that informed public policy and other sites. So that's how I came into hip hop, through writing. But it was at University of Georgia where I, as a graduate student, where I thought, okay, there can be some intellectual contribution that we see. And I remember my Black feminist professor at the time said, girl, no, what are you talking about? Hip hop feminism. This is a contradictory in terms, but it was a necessary contradiction in terms of thinking about the ways in which we could talk about gender politics. So there, I had some conferences for which you participated, and your research early on was instrumental for me in thinking about, the kind of cultural scripts that we're invited to perform or enact as Black girls and women, but also in terms of the whole economy of hip hop that really used Black women in order to sell hip hop as a commercial product. So I began writing about that I guess, that emphasis, along with thinking about other kinds of ways, particularly in terms of political or what we would dub quote unquote conscious hip hop, because then I saw, oh, this is a more positive aspect of hip hop, but we know that's also a kind of mythology. But that was the alternative to the kind of hypersexualized representations that we saw in popular culture.
I think what you said was so powerful in that the rejection of the work, like how is feminism and hip hop being fitted? And as I shared with you, my advisor was like, that's not real research. And this was another Black woman researcher saying that. And so this type of resistance to feminism being mixed with hip hop, or hip hop feminism coming through, was really done at a time that was difficult, but it was really also central. But at that time, which was the late 90s, early 2000s, why you think hip hop feminism came to be where it was, or how it became galvanized. And you talked about Joan Morgan's When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost. I remember that, that was the groundbreaking book. So can you talk about how that timing might have been central for this type of discussion taking place, or this sort of theoretical framework emerging?
Yeah, well, in the 1990s, there was a proliferation of hip hop journalism. So whether you had it in terms of news writing or entertainment writing with The Source, Vibe, Honey, and you have Black women, Black and Latina women who were actually writing in very sophisticated ways about hip hop culture, but particularly in terms of gender, politics. So you had these popular conversations that were going on that were using Black feminism, citing bell hooks, citing Black feminist thought. But there was a disconnect in the academy between how we understood Black feminism and Black feminist thought as a body of knowledge within the academy, and how it was working in the quote unquote real world or outside the academy. And I think someone like Trisha Rose, Gwendolyn Pugh, and even Joan Morgan, who was not recognized as a theorist at the time, but she's absolutely a Black feminist theorist, bringing or bridging that kind of popular or experiential knowledge and that kind of academic or expertise in terms of Black feminist intellectual work together. And in some ways, I don't think that is happenstance. If we look to how we think about Black women's advocacy and activism, Black women's creative work that is couched within the language of womenism and feminism, all of it pulls from the kind of sacred, secular, pulls from that intellectual and the popular. So I think hip hop feminism was a kind of push in the academy to say, hey, popular culture is this important site that we ought to be paying attention to. And at the time, I saw it as a generational shift. And, 20 years later, and now teaching hip hop studies, when students were coming to me with trap feminism and ratchet feminism, and I'm like, hold up, what is this? Clutching my pearls. I had to also think about the same way that I came into that classroom saying, hey, I have this new way of thinking about Black feminist thought. And some of the very people like Aria Holiday and others who are doing the same work, Regina Bradley, and talking about ratchet feminism, they are also that kind of generational force. And I think it's beautiful because what it's doing is it's showing the viability of Black feminist thought across the generations with different iterations.
So I think that's important. So a couple of things you've just triggered for me here is, one, is hip hop feminism squared within the musical culture? Is hip hop feminism specific to those who are part of hip hop culture or those of the hip hop generations? Maybe you could speak about it in terms of how hip hop feminism is representational of the musical genre and how it's changed or not changed with the genre.
So I can talk about hip hop feminism without talking about hip hop music or rap music. One of the things that I wanted to stress early on in terms of my work is that hip hop feminism is a generational understanding of gender and sexual politics. So when we talk about hip hop feminism, we talk about it as a creative, intellectual, social and political movement grounded in the situated knowledge of girls and women of color from the post-civil rights, if we're talking about the U.S., or hip-hop generations, because they could be different depending on which culture or community, who recognize culture as a pivotal site to make political interventions to mobilize, dismantle, or resist systems of exploitation. And this is a definition that I helped to develop early on, again, modeling after Patricia O'Connor and what is Black feminism. And I wanted to say, this is what we think about when we're saying hip hop feminism. So it is a generational construct. This is the first, and again, I'm being specific to the United States here, understanding that it is a global project. It is a first generation to grow up after major civil rights legislation, whether we're talking about the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. So on paper, we are supposed to be equal. It is also coming of age doing other kind of mass mobilization movements, whether it's in terms of gay liberation, feminist, women's liberation, as well as Black power in the civil rights generation. So you have a confluence of activity in terms of moving to what we can realize as a kind of more inclusive democratic society. So at the time that we have all of this kind of movement toward kind of inclusivity or even economic, social, political mobility, you have generations like me who grew up in public housing, generations of poverty, and understanding that what constitutes that American dream is still deferred for people who look like me. And so whether it's globalization, deindustrialization, the backlash in terms of affirmative action, and we should hear that there's an echo of all of these things that are happening now. This is a climate by which you have Black and brown youth growing up who make no connection to the ways in which we see mass media today, or even thinking about the generational construct of respectability, deference to elders. So it is all of this that is happening. And so when we're talking about the kind of early kind of formation of hip hop, it was youth mainly speaking to themselves, about themselves and their own experience, not necessarily thinking about who's watching and who is consuming. It was a way of really in terms of thinking about expression. Now, that kind of, some might say it is nostalgic to think about, the old days as if it was not connected to capitalism because people were still selling cassette tapes and later CDs out of their trunk. So it was still a business. Or thinking about sexual violence, you have graffiti writers and MCs, female MCs who are also experiencing sexual violence within the culture. So, but that time in some ways was kind of mass consumption. It was before we have MTV, BET, and other kind Viacom ways in which we see the music video. So that's a long way to say that no, it does not have to be about rap music or hip hop music, but it does have to be centered in the experiences of people of color who are coming out of what we might define as a hip hop generation. And of course, we have multiple generations since 1965. But by the time we get to the 1990s, and if I could do a chronology from the 1990s to the 2000s to the 2010s, the 1990s, really women at this time were talking about underrepresentation because the way in which, and we still have seen this right now in the 50th anniversary, you're still having conversations of, okay, Queen Latifah, I love you, but you're not only MC. Like, we're going to show some representation of Black women, but Black women have been there from the inception, from the very birthday of hip hop on August 11, 1973. Who are sisters there helping to facilitate that. So women have been there and girls have been there from the very beginning, not just in terms of organizing, but producing, stylizing, even the ways in which we think about hip hop today that is part almost song and rap. Many of the early MCs, like Missy Elliott, were a part of girl groups before. They were singing before they were even MCing. So the very kind of construction of hip hop, I would say, is birthed in part from women. So there's an underrepresentation in terms of how we see, like we don't even see women. And if we do see them, they're in the background. They're the dancers. Again, that's labor, but they're not recognized as such. By the time we get to the 2000s, we have a firm hold in some ways is in part because of the music video. So where you have the dancers and the people in the background, you have them moving to the front. And now it's the woman with the mic. Again, not saying that we're not recognizing Roxanne Shante, Sweet Tea, and all of those, but in terms of visibility, insofar as you no longer have to just be the one person of the group, but you can be a solo MC. This might mean that you're battling each other in terms of disc records, or you're talking about solidarity. So there's a bigger kind of way in which we could think about, and this is where you have all the kind of proliferation of representations that you have written extensively about. And so here it's like we're at the party. So at first we weren't even invited to the party. We're at the party, but what are we saying? So we are here, but we still don't have a defined way of what we are saying and how we're seen. So by the 2010s, I think that becomes more solidified. It becomes more solidified in terms of the kinds of topics that women are talking about, the ways in which the specific kinds of kind of contributions, like women talking about domestic violence or intimate partner violence, women talking about sexual violence, women talking about sexual pleasure, pleasure on women's own terms, or, just thinking about the interiority or the inner kind of thoughts of Black women that we rarely get to see, if not inside of a Alice Walker's novel. We rarely get to understand the motivations, the impetus, the fears of Black women because of those, tropes of like the strong Black woman. So in hip hop, we get to see kind of a multifaceted Black woman. And again, we have a proliferation of women in hip hop. By the 2020s, in some ways, we've almost taken those things for granted. So that when we have something like WAP, we see it as like, wow, that is just out there. Not understanding that we haven't even heard some of the stuff that from the 1980s and 1990s, but it is as if we take for granted this idea of reclaiming one's sexuality. And that's a huge intervention in terms of Black and Latinas representation, considering that one of the ways in which we become visible is through the lens of, the male MC. So those are kind of, if we could do a chronology in terms of, hip hop feminism, or the kind of themes of hip hop feminism, some of those might be it.
So thinking about hip hop feminism, and I appreciate you taking that history because I think it's important, especially coming from psychology. We often just land here. But thinking about hip hop feminism and that whole history that you've presented, which is critically important, where do you think we are today? Like, what do you think is happening now? And also, how is it shaping the ways in which Brown and Black women are engaging the world around them?
So I've been thinking about this a lot. And I've been thinking about it because on the one hand, I don't want to seem like my old professor. It's like, what is this? But who I adore. But I also, there are ways in which the emphasis on sexual politics or sexual pleasure is a narrow way of looking at freedom. That is a freedom. And the idea of thinking about pleasure, of desire, of yearning, these are fundamental to the human condition, for which Black women have been unable to express because of those dominant images, scripts, or tropes. But it is to say there is a way in which the only way that Black women can talk about liberation, can talk about power, is through the power of the pussy. It's through the power of our pocketbook, if I can be Southern about that. So there's a way in which the kind of popularity in terms of talking about women and power is in some ways limited within that scope. Again, very important, especially in this moment where women's reproduction, women's pleasure are being kind of legislated as nil. But I think that is a limitation. But I can tell you through the different kinds of movements, whether sister song and connections to larger reproductive justice, whether we're talking about Me Too, Mute R. Kelly in terms of thinking about sexual violence. You have women who are talking about sexual politics and gender politics, but taking to task. So there are these spaces in which we have, okay, you want me to talk about sexual politics? I will. I'm going to talk about Me Too. And I think in some ways that has been one of the most revolutionary aspects of, thinking about sexual politics and hip hop feminism. But where I see it going, I don't know. In some ways, hip hop, in terms of a cultural formation or a broader cultural project, has always had to reinvent itself. I think I am fascinated by kind of gender inclusivity and thinking about gender identity in terms of a spectrum. I am fascinated by the discussion of mental health and mental wellness. I am, there are some artists for me who, do the reach back to old school and kind of think of Rhapsody as one of those MCs for me who, not just her lyricism, but the ways in which she kind of pulls back to bring us forward is in her range in terms of not just the topics, but, her MCing is just fascinating to me. So I'm here for it. I can't say that I'm listening to a lot of Ice Spice, Dolce, and City Girls. Maybe a little bit. Context matters. But context mattered then. I wasn't gonna necessarily listen to Lil Kim. But the club, they're not playing Queen Latifah. They play Lil Kim. So it's generational, and at this. Hip hop is 50. I'm there. I feel it all in my classes. I am there. But I'm here for it. So the broadening who can be included in the space has been the most kind of intriguing for me.
Now, I might be biased, and I just want to jump back to something you talked about. And I'm wondering the centrality, again, I support the sexuality as empowering and framing, especially since Black women have always been framed as the beasts and sexualized and exoticized. But it's also been the one space where, through the histories, that's the one space where we've been given, or I shouldn't even say given, but there was power has been allowed to express ourselves. But that's also to make the others feel comfortable and give them pleasure. And I'm wondering if hip hop feminism, why sexuality is centered in it so much, because it is a media. It comes from media space. And it's one of the spaces where Black women can be seen and visualized in a way that other theoretical frameworks are not centered in this media that is so visual, that is so able to take up space in the mainstream outside of just a Black only space. And I wonder if you want to comment on that.
Well, I think I guess we can say popularity, or the broader reception of hip hop feminism has everything to do with our engagement in popular culture. So I think that is and that is deliberate. It's not. I mean, there are ways in which, early on when I was writing about hip hop and feminism and popular culture, it was just there. Like, it's there. I'm just bracketing this. Now I'm studying it very differently. But I think that is one of the most democratizing things about hip hop feminism is that not just the engagement with popular culture, but the ways in which we choose to represent that knowledge. I was a former blogger with Trump Feminist Collective, with Brittany Cooper, Moya Bailey, and others. And we were applying women of color and Black feminist thought in order to say something about what was happening. Again, connecting it to popular culture, but bringing it in terms of a broader public. So I think that way of not just engaging with the popular, but using popular forms, whether it's like social media, to engage with what can seem very heady or this is just for academics. It makes it accessible. And I think that has become the popularity of hip hop feminisms and the kind of other iterations of it, from trap to ratchet and others.
I love how you discussed that it's about the accessibility of this framework. And so I'm wondering now, sitting on the other side where we both sit and we know how academia, the ivory tower works, how is it today to implement hip hop feminism in academic spaces? And I think it's important that we talk about this because, right or wrong, it's still viewed as a space where knowledge is being, and I have my hand in air quotes, created here. So how is it being responded? Because we really don't care about how people are responding to it. But how could
it matters. I mean, it matters, especially for, even emerging scholars who are using the work in terms of, hip hop feminism. So one of the aspects of hip hop feminism, I remember when I was first doing kind of performance poetry, and I submitted my annual review, and I remember one of my chairs said, these little poems, they're great, but this isn't academic knowledge. And I said, I don't think people go around saying Audre Lorde and Tony K. I don't think we go around saying, that's like cute. We think about them as serious theorists. And I said, I am speaking in the language of my mothers, my sisters, my four, and this is in an academic journal. So we still have the pushback, not only in terms of the topics that we choose to talk about, seeing Black women not as objects of knowledge, but subjects of knowledge and subjects within their own history making. That in and of itself pushes back on ways in which we think about who constructs knowledge, who is an object of study, who is a subject of one's own history, but then to do so in terms of forms, representational forms, whether that's autoethnography, personal narrative, memoir, performance poetry, film, all of these different kinds of forms that are democratizing and accessible forms. So I would read things to my mom. She may not know all of the theoretical kind of framing, but she's like, I hear that. I feel that. And that kind of crystallization, if I could use words or distillation of experience, is one of the ways in which, Black feminism in general has resonance in different spaces. So, I think that it is necessary for us to do that kind of citational work to show that this isn't in a vacuum, that this is knowledge that is coming from, lived experience. It is, what, Shay Moraga and others call, theorizing, in the flesh. So I really think that, and I'm saying Shay Moraga and Gloria Underzua, I really think that what hip hop feminism, and again, hip hop feminism doesn't exist without Black feminist thought. I think what hip hop feminism is doing is actually challenging those very constructions of who gets to be a knowledge bearer, who gets to author theory, and who are the subjects of theory making.
So what do you think is next now? Where do you think it's going? What do you think will be the next phase for hip hop feminism and its impact on ongoing research and how we're looking at Black women's lives?
Well, because hip hop feminism is a generation, or as Ruth Nicole Brown says, a genderation construct. In some ways, this is the future is to those younger scholars or those newer scholars who are envisioning new ways of being and belonging. In some ways, I felt like a better part of 20 years was kind of defining the field, articulating like how we are understanding the field. But again, from these other kinds of iterations that are not just based on music, even though we say ratchet and trap and crunk is not just music, is in terms of a broader culture and a regional understanding in terms of culture. We see all forms of, again, offshoots, if you want to say, of hip hop feminism. But, I've read some work by younger scholars who are just like, even as we're talking about sexual politics, there's still this kind of queen hoe dynamic. And so I received that. I received that with the same kind of understanding that when I hear people say respectability politics and they just, and I'm like, but do you understand the historical context by which people are saying, hey, you're not seeing me. Perhaps if I am performing and acting, they were doing it as a political strategy, not in terms of just some kind of moral way of engaging with the world, but it was a political strategy, and it was a supposedly temporary one that then morphed into something else. And so in this sense, when I am seeing the ways in which, hip hop feminism is now associated with respectability, I'm like, wow, you have no idea the panels that I have been on where I've had to, like, in some ways argue just for Black women's existence, let alone Black women's contribution to a culture as well as to hip hop studies in and of itself. In some ways, women of color academicians are still undervalued in terms of our unique contribution to the discussion of hip hop. So, yeah, I don't know what the future looks like. I just know that, within the time in terms of when I began writing and what I'm writing about now, which seems kind of retrospective. I'm working on a piece now talking about LaKaylee. I love LaKaylee. She reminds me of Missy. Both are she represents New York, but she comes from Virginia. So I'm talking about, this liminal space that Virginia has. I mean, these kinds of things intrigue me now. Also, in terms of the playing with sexuality, and sexuality in terms of queer sexuality. So there's I don't know. Again, I'm open to these newer iterations, but I don't know if I'm necessarily the person to put forth these newer ones. I will leave that to younger generations to carve out.
That was Dr. Aisha Durham, professor of media and communication at the University of South Florida and co-editor of the critically acclaimed hip-hop feminist anthology, Homegirls Make Some Noise. To find out more about Dr. Durham, including accessing her articles, website, and various social media handles, go to this episode on our website's podcast page. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast. We have some really great guests lined up for the upcoming shows, so be sure to check out our episode topics by going to our website, www.psychologyofblackwomanhood.com. One more thing before I go. Please be sure to show us some love by leaving a review on whatever platform you used to access this recording. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon. And make sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or X if you prefer, if you haven't already.